3 fines in 1 week. That's what I found when I swung by my lake cabin to restock the firewood and grab my fishing gear. 3 bright yellow envelopes slapped to the front door like some kind of HOA ransom note. All of them signed by Nancy Strickland, president of the Whispering Pines Lakefront Homeowners Association, and the most insufferable middle-aged busybody I've ever encountered. Now, let me be clear. My cabin isn't even in Whispering Pines. It's on the next ridge over, part of unincorporated county land that deliberately kept itself out of HOA jurisdiction when the area was zoned decades ago. I know because my late Uncle Martin built the place himself and made it a point to never let it fall under any HOA's thumb. I've kept every deed and plat map filed and laminated. But apparently, Nancy and her HOA cronies didn't get the memo, or worse, they ignored it. The first fine was for excessive moss on roof shingles. The second? Unapproved dock paint color. The third one sent me over the edge, failure to obtain architectural approval for fire pit installation. I stood there on the porch with those papers flapping in my hand and muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." I drove straight to the HOA office, which is basically a converted garage attached to Nancy's oversized lake house. She was outside trimming her rose bushes like she was the queen of lakeside suburbia, wearing a visor and a bright pink windbreaker like she was headed to a tennis match that never existed. "Oh, hello, Mr. Jacobsen," she said, pretending she didn't know exactly why I was there. "I do hope you've reviewed the citations we issued." "They're not citations, Nancy," I said, keeping my voice flat. "They're fantasy. You've got no jurisdiction over my cabin." She sniffed. "We recently expanded the HOA boundaries to include adjacent properties. Whispering Pines has standards and we intend to uphold them." "Expand it?" I raised an eyebrow. "You can't just redraw boundaries like it's a monopoly board." "We held a vote," she said, smug as ever. "It passed unanimously." "Let me guess," I said. "You and your 2 friends on the board voted behind closed doors?" She didn't answer. Instead, she handed me another envelope. "You have until the end of the month to comply or we'll begin lien proceedings." I stared at her for a long moment, then said, "You're gonna regret this." She laughed, which was a mistake. See, what Nancy didn't know is that I'm not just some random lake guy with a grudge and a chainsaw. I'm Mason Jacobsen. I used to be a legislative aide in the state capitol for 7 years. I know the law. I know land use codes. And more importantly, I know someone who can put a very official signature on a very real cease and desist letter, Governor Helena Ward, who I've known since she was a county commissioner. By the time I got back home that night, I had already pulled the boundary maps, the zoning codes, and every legal document proving that Whispering Pines had no right to touch my property. I put it all together in a tidy packet and mailed it certified right to Nancy's mailbox. 2 days later, she doubled down, sent me a final warning letter with a fake hearing date. That's when I made the call. "Helena," I said when she picked up, "I've got a little HOA problem. Mind lending your name to a cease and desist?" She chuckled. "Still fighting the good fight, huh? Draft it up and send it. I'll sign it myself." It arrived at Nancy's doorstep 5 days later, official state letterhead, bold print at the top, and Governor Helena Ward's signature right at the bottom. I included a copy of the zoning map, land deed, and a highlighted section of the HOA's own charter that clearly excluded my property. I didn't hear a peep for 3 days. Then came the knock on my cabin door. The man at my door wore khakis, a tucked-in button-down, and the kind of cautious expression that telegraphed trouble long before he said a word. "Mr. Jacobsen?" he asked. "That's me. Detective Ray McClendon, County Sheriff's Office. Mind if I come in for a moment?" I stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. He scanned the place like he was trying to connect dots in the air. "Something happen?" I asked once we were seated. "I just came from Whispering Pines," he said, pulling out a small notepad. "Got a report from their HOA board, claims you threatened their president with political retaliation." I stared at him, then laughed once. "That's what they're going with?" "That's what they wrote in the complaint," he nodded. Said you used a government connection to intimidate them. Detective, I sent a cease and desist with legal documentation proving they're trespassing on property that isn't within their jurisdiction. It's not intimidation when you're enforcing the law. He tapped his pen once against the pad. Did you involve the governor's office? Yes. I worked under her for years. She signed off on the letter after reviewing the case herself. He nodded slowly. You mind if I take a look at the paperwork? I walked to the filing cabinet and pulled the packet. I'd made copies of everything, including the boundary maps and the HOA's own charter. I handed it over. He flipped through it, stopping occasionally to read a highlighted line or cross-reference a map. After a few minutes, he closed the folder. Well, he said, standing, this clears things up. But I'll be honest with you, this isn't the first time I've had to deal with something like this from that association. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Last year, they tried to tow a veteran's RV off his own land. Claimed it was an eyesore. Problem was, he lived outside their boundary too. Got real messy when the tow company damaged his irrigation system. Whole thing went to small claims court. And? He won. HOA had to pay damages. But they didn't change tactics, they just got sneakier. I shook my head. So this is a pattern. Looks like it, he said. I'm going to file this incident as unfounded. If they contact you again, give me a call. I watched him drive off, then grabbed my keys and headed straight to the county records office. If this was a pattern, I needed to see it myself. Inside, the clerk, an older woman with sharp glasses and a sharper memory, helped me pull every public complaint and civil filing involving Whispering Pines HOA from the past 5 years. What I found was worse than I expected. There were 8 separate cases of overreach. 2 involved unauthorized entry onto private property. 1 included a false claim of delinquent dues against a widow whose husband had built their house long before Whispering Pines was incorporated. Another showed the HOA had quietly tried to reclassify a public easement as private park space in order to collect usage fees from non-residents. And then I found it, a filing from 6 months ago that alleged misappropriation of funds. An anonymous whistleblower had submitted bank statements showing HOA dues being funneled into a private account under the name of Nancy Strickland's son. That complaint had been quietly closed with insufficient evidence, but the numbers were right there. I scanned them, printed copies, and called a friend of mine who worked in the state auditor's office. Eli, I said when he picked up, you still digging into HOA fraud? Every day. You got something? Got a potential embezzlement case. Whispering Pines Lakefront HOA. Want me to send what I've got? Absolutely. Send it tonight. While the documents uploaded, I called the county zoning board and requested a hearing. If they were trying to expand their boundary illegally, I wanted it on the public record. 3 days later, I received a certified envelope from a law firm hired by the HOA. Inside was an aggressive cease and desist directed at me, claiming I was harassing and interfering with the lawful operations of the HOA. I dropped it right into a folder labeled Evidence. The next day, I installed 2 trail cams, one facing the driveway, another pointed at the back fence line. I had a hunch someone would try to escalate. Sure enough, that weekend, just after dusk, the motion sensor pinged my phone. Live feed showed a man in a navy hoodie slipping around the side of the cabin. He crouched behind the woodpile, then crept toward the breaker box. I called the sheriff's office immediately. By the time deputies arrived, the man had tripped on a root, twisted his knee, and was crawling back toward his car. They arrested him on the spot. The best part? His wallet held a Whispering Pines board member ID. Vice President. Name George Paxton. They found bolt cutters in his trunk and a printed map of my property with handwritten notes. Detective McClendon returned the next morning. You weren't exaggerating, he said, standing beside the cruiser while they loaded Paxton in the back. Looks like they were planning to mess with your utilities. Cutting power to a remote cabin on a wooded ridge? That's not mischief, that's life endangering. He nodded. We'll be filing charges. And I've got enough now to open a broader investigation into that HOA. I didn't say anything. I just handed him the folder I'd labeled Financial Irregularities. He gave a low whistle as he flipped through the first few pages. This is good, he muttered. Real good. Within 48 hours, the county zoning board issued a public notice. Whispering Pines' attempted boundary expansion was illegal and void. 2 days after that, Nancy Strickland received a subpoena. The sheriff's office raided the HOA's tiny office, seizing ledgers, hard drives, and dozens of meeting recordings. The cherry on top? The local news ran a segment titled "Lakefront Power Grab, HOA Oversteps Its Bounds," complete with drone footage of my cabin and a side-by-side zoning map showing how completely unrelated my property was. Neighbors started coming forward. One by one, they showed up at my door or left notes in my mailbox. Stories of threats, bogus fines, and deliberate retaliation. I compiled every testimony and turned them over to the investigator assigned to the case. By the end of the week, Nancy was no longer returning calls. Her house sat dark at night, the porch light off for the first time in years. Then came the special meeting. Not held by the HOA, by the residents. They gathered in the community center and took a vote of no confidence. With a 2/3 majority, they dissolved the existing board and placed Whispering Pines under temporary administrative oversight. I received an invitation to attend as an honorary guest. When I walked in, people clapped. One man, a retired dock worker named Theo, handed me a gift basket filled with local honey and smoked trout. "You did what nobody else could," he said. "You stopped her." I didn't say much. Just nodded and took a seat in the back. Because I knew something they didn't. The real storm was still coming. The audit results were due in 2 weeks. And from what I'd seen in those ledgers, they were going to blow the roof off the place. A week after the community meeting, the first domino fell. I was standing at the edge of the dock, tying off the new canoe I'd bought with a gift card from one of the neighbors when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring twice, then answered. "This is Jacobsen." "Mr. Jacobsen, this is Special Investigator Carla Mendez, State Auditor's Office. I received your referral through Eli Tran. I'm calling to inform you that we're initiating a formal inquiry into financial records tied to Whispering Pines Lakefront HOA." I reeled the line in, sat back on the dock, and listened as she laid out what they'd found in the preliminary review. 10 years of misreported expenses, overlapping personal and HOA accounts, and most damning proof of a shell landscaping company receiving bi-monthly payments for services never rendered. That shell company was registered under Nancy Strickland's sister's name. "That's not just misuse," I said. "That's felony-level fraud." "Yes," Mendez agreed. "And because HOA funds were collected under the pretense of mandatory dues, we're treating it as wire fraud and conspiracy to commit theft by deception." She paused. "We'll be coordinating with the District Attorney's Office and the Department of Consumer Protection. Expect subpoenas to go out by Friday." By Saturday morning, a white Crown Vic with government plates was parked outside Nancy's house. 2 agents in dark windbreakers stepped out and rang the bell. She didn't answer. Instead, a man in his early 30s cracked the door. Her son. Based on the photos I'd seen in the HOA newsletter, the agents served the papers, then walked the perimeter, all while a neighbor across the street filmed from her porch with barely concealed satisfaction. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Theo. "Something's happening at the HOA office," he said. 3 cruisers are parked out front, and they're pulling boxes out like it's a crime scene. It was. Detective McClendon confirmed it when he called me an hour later. "We recovered documents hidden in the ceiling tiles," he said. "Handwritten ledgers, unreported cash payments, and a burner phone logged with dozens of deleted texts between board members coordinating illegal activity. We're passing everything to the state's attorney." The next morning, a temporary HOA administrator appointed by the county posted a public notice on the community bulletin board. All Whispering Pines accounts were frozen until further notice. No dues would be collected. No fines enforced. All prior citations were null and void pending investigation. I didn't gloat. Not exactly. But I did make sure to walk through the neighborhood that afternoon, just a quiet stroll, nodding at folks sipping iced tea on their porches, waving at kids riding bikes. No one said anything at first. Then a woman I didn't recognize stepped off her front stoop and met me near the sidewalk. "You're Mason, right?" she asked. "Depends who's asking." She grinned and extended a hand. "Jessica, I live over on Hemlock." Nancy fined me for having solar panels visible from the road. Said they were aesthetic pollution. I took out a loan to have them moved. I shook her hand. I'm sorry you went through that. She looked down the street toward the lake. Not anymore. You turned the tide. Before I could answer, another neighbor joined. Then another. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed around me, each person with a story, each one more absurd than the last. One man had been fined for installing a wheelchair ramp without design approval. A retired teacher had her mailbox removed at night for exceeding the HOA's color palette. Someone else claimed their garden gnome had been confiscated during a compliance drive. I listened. I took notes. And when the temporary administrator, a no-nonsense woman named Nadine from the County Oversight Office, arrived to conduct a community review, I handed her a folder full of every testimony. She didn't blink. We'll be filing for restitution on behalf of residents, she said. Anyone who paid illegal fines will be eligible for reimbursement. As the pieces came together, Nancy finally cracked. She tried to flee. One evening, just before dusk, she loaded a suitcase and 2 garbage bags into the back of a rented SUV and drove toward the county line. Unfortunately for her, the sheriff's office had flagged her license plate. She was intercepted at a gas station 20 miles south, trying to withdraw cash from an ATM. Deputies arrested her on the spot for obstruction and attempted flight to avoid prosecution. Her son was picked up the next morning, charged as an accessory to fraud. That night, I got a call from a local reporter who'd been following the story since the audit announcement. We're doing a piece on homeowners standing up to corrupt HOAs, she said. Would you be willing to go on record? I hesitated. I'm not looking for headlines. Then how about accountability? She asked. This story's bigger than your lake cabin. We've received tips from 3 other communities where HOA boards are pulling similar stunts. That got my attention. I'll talk, I said. But we do this on site. You come out, see the cabin, walk the land, read the documents. No cherry picking. She agreed. 2 days later, she arrived with a cameraman and a legal analyst in tow. I gave them the grand tour, showed them the survey lines, the old deed, the trail cam footage, and the official zoning decisions. I even handed them the original cease and desist with the governor's seal. When the segment aired, it went viral. Not because of me, but because of what came next. During the interview, the reporter mentioned that the Whispering Pines HOA had attempted to obtain a loan against future dues collections. That loan, over $200,000, was processed through a small regional credit union under false pretenses. When the credit union saw the news, they launched their own internal review. Turns out Nancy had used falsified financial statements to secure the loan, claiming full community approval and backing. None of it existed. Now it was bank fraud. At the next county council meeting, a resolution was passed to permanently dissolve the existing HOA charter. Whispering Pines would remain a community but without the ability to enforce dues or fines. Any future governance would require independent oversight and state certification. It was over. The fences came down. The community center was open to all residents, regardless of donation status. The approved vendor-only list was tossed. People started painting their homes in whatever colors they liked. Solar panels popped up. Garden gnomes returned in droves. I went back to living quietly at the cabin, fishing in the mornings, splitting logs in the evenings. Every once in a while, someone would stop by just to shake my hand or drop off a jar of pickled beans. And one morning, as I stood on the porch drinking coffee, Theo pulled up in his beat-up truck. You ever think about running for the new community board? He asked. Not my style, I said. He laughed. That's why you'd be good at it. I considered that for a moment. The lake was quiet. The sun was just edging over the tree-line. A heron drifted low over the water. Maybe, I said. But only if we ban pink windbreakers. The first real snow hit the lake in early November, covering everything in a thick, clean silence. The kind that made you forget how loud summer had been. Boats, lawn mowers, HOA trucks creeping around with clipboards. Whispering Pines had gone quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes after a courtroom gavel, not a sunset. I was splitting seasoned oak by the woodshed when Nadine's county vehicle pulled up. She always drove with purpose, even on gravel. The tires crunched to a stop and she stepped out, holding a folder that looked heavier than usual. "Got a moment?" she asked, brushing snow from her coat sleeve. "Of course," I said, setting the axe aside. "You bring good news or bad?" "Both," she said, walking past the porch and into the warmth of the cabin like she'd done it 100 times. "But mostly good, depending on how you define justice." She set the folder down on my table and opened it. Inside were transcripts, bank logs, and printed screenshots of email threads. Each top page had a state seal stamped in the corner. Nancy kept a separate system, she said. Hidden off the books, completely disconnected from HOA software. Ran it through an old laptop in her garage that she never connected to the internet. Was the laptop recovered? Yes. We found it hidden in a false drawer beneath the workbench. Took a while to crack it, but our forensic techs finally got in last week. She tapped the top document with a short fingernail. Turns out she wasn't just misappropriating funds. She was laundering them. I leaned forward. Laundering where? Through shell companies in 3 different states. Landscaping, maintenance, and a fake consulting firm registered in Nevada. I pulled the top sheet closer. The amounts weren't small. We were talking about hundreds of thousands slowly funneled through inflated invoices, then quietly withdrawn in cash just under the reporting threshold. "Where's the money now?" I asked. "Some of it's been spent," Nadine admitted. "But a large portion ended up in a trust fund for her grandkids. We've frozen it. Prosecutors are working to seize the assets." "And the board?" I asked. 3 of the 5 are cooperating. 1 has agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges. The 5th's lawyer is playing hardball, but we've got his signature on several falsified audits. It won't hold up. I sat back in the chair and exhaled slowly. "Anything else?" She hesitated, then flipped to the last page. "There's one more thing. We found evidence that the HOA used private investigators to dig into residents who challenged them. Financial backgrounds, family court records, even credit pulls. All done without consent." I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. They were spying on people? Yes, and not just for leverage. In one case, they used the information to threaten a resident into selling. The buyer, a company run by Nancy's brother-in-law, bought 5 properties that way. "That's coercion," I said. "And it's being charged as exactly that. The DA's office is filing under racketeering statutes." "It's officially a RICO case now." I didn't speak for a moment, just stared at the snow falling outside the window as if it might bury the memory of everything she'd just said. Nadine stood and zipped her coat. "I thought you should hear it from me," she said. "You started this. You deserve the update. Appreciate that." As she stepped outside and drove off, I realized something. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I was tired. Tired of digging through rot. Tired of fixing other people's messes. But also finally done. The next few weeks moved with steady finality. Nancy was indicted on 12 felony counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and wire tampering. She took a plea deal but still faced real prison time. Her son was sentenced to supervised probation and ordered to pay restitution. The house went up for auction before the year was out. The new community board, composed entirely of residents who had never served under the old regime, voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. They replaced it with a voluntary neighborhood council with no enforcement power. Just a group of folks who met once a month to talk about dock repairs, snowplow schedules, and who'd bring the cornbread to the next potluck. The governor's office issued a statement commending the investigation and announcing new legislation aimed at increasing transparency in HOA operations statewide. They called it the Homeowner Fairness Act. I didn't ask for credit and Helena didn't offer any, but she did send me a handwritten note tucked inside a Christmas card. "You were right," it read. "They picked the wrong cabin. Spring arrived with a slow melt and the return of birdsong. The lake thawed in uneven circles and kids started appearing on bikes again. One afternoon I heard a knock, not a tense one, just casual. When I opened the door, it was Theo and a man I hadn't met before. Mason, this is Curtis, Theo said. He just moved into the old blue house on the ridge. Thought he should meet the guy who cleaned up the mess. Curtis was in his late 40s with oil-stained hands and the kind of calm that came from working with machines more than people. I heard the stories, he said. Didn't believe half of them. Then I saw the news footage. I didn't do it alone, I said. He shrugged. Still hell of a thing. I brought a six-pack if you're not busy. We sat out by the fire pit, the same one that Nancy once tried to find me for, and watched the sun dip behind the ridge. Curtis asked, so what made you fight instead of just paying the fines and moving on? I tossed a stick into the flames. Because the moment you give in to a bully, it doesn't end. They don't take your apology and go home. They take it as permission. Theo nodded. We needed someone to say no. Curtis cracked a beer. Well, I'm glad you did. Feels like a real town now. Not a gated kingdom. As the fire popped and the lake quieted, I realized something I hadn't felt since the first day I inherited the cabin. Peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of something better. A neighborhood that had learned how to stand together. A place where power didn't hide behind bylaws and where people looked out for each other instead of policing flower beds. Eventually the fire burned low and the moon came up over the ridge. Curtis said goodnight and walked back through the trees. Theo lingered a while longer. You ever think about selling? He asked. Not once. He smiled, then stood up and stretched. Good. We need people like you around here. Remind us how to hold the line. After he left, I sat alone beside the coals, listening to the water lap against the dock. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out across the dark. The war was over. The cabin was mine again, not just by deed, but in spirit. And the HOA? It would never rise again. Not here. Not after what came to light. Not after the files, the indictments, the testimonies. They'd buried themselves in greed and arrogance. And when the community finally saw it, they didn't look away. They stood up. And I stood with them.